Illinois Forage and Grassland Council, supporting the production, marketing, and wise use of Illinois' forages and grasslands. Join today at illinoisforage.org. Now, our speakers.
For joining us today. We're going to talk to you a little bit about understanding forage quality with an emphasis on getting a forage analysis done, why that would be important, and how you can use that as a producer. So today, I'm Travis Mateer. I work for the University of Illinois as a beef extension specialist. I've got with me today Greg Zerlini and Dr. Jennifer Earing. Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about your role and helping us here today, and then Dr. Earing, you can follow Greg.
Good morning, Greg Zerlini. As Travis mentioned, I'm a territory manager for Pottinger Forage Equipment here in the Midwest, and sell hay and forage equipment to benefit producers throughout the Southeast and the Midwest. Currently, we run beef cows as well. I do a lot of hay marketing as well with some of my customers, just because I cover so much real estate and know who's looking for the different commodities, different types of hay and whatnot.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Earing. I'm currently faculty at Illinois State University, where I'm teaching animal science classes. By training, I'm an equine nutritionist. And I have a pretty strong interest in forage quality and how that relates to meeting the horse's nutrient requirements. And so I'm excited to be here to talk to you guys a little bit about some of the forage tests.
Awesome. We've got a good team for our conversation today. And I think all of us are involved in roles on the IFGC board. And so in some of our board meetings and conversations we've had, we innately talk about forages and forage quality and getting a hay test. And Greg really brought forth some big points on why that would be important. And his interaction with producers on a day-to-day basis is really crucial. But Greg, you've got what we call, I guess, or what I would coin as the big four. What are the big four reasons why we should be interested in getting our forages tested?
Yeah, thanks again for the introduction, Travis. Greg Zerlini here. The big four that Travis is referring to, and the number one thing what I feel is the most important is the price. You basically figure out what's in your forage and how good a production you've done with it and practices of putting it up. And you can, set the price accordingly to what you feel is the right dollar amount. As far as a seller, as far as a buyer, when you're looking at forage analysis and hay samples that have been tested, this will allow you to leverage some price points with a poor quality test or a high quality test. The second of the big four is the nutrient content and potential dangers. This is, whenever you do a forage sample, you can find out the nitrate levels, you can find out the fibers, starches, sugars, ash content, and the list goes on and on, as we'll see later on in some slides, the different ranges there is and all the stuff that comes back from an analysis. I know in my career, I have had the opportunity to go to some forage sampling labs, and if you're either in the hay production business or feeding any type of livestock, I'd highly recommend it. I know the one up at Silo King, Agri King up at Fulton, Illinois. It's pretty neat deal. So along with that, when we start looking at when we know what's in our forage, and that leads to the third point that I have today is the overfeeding, the palatability. If whether you're feeding horses, cows, goats, sheep, all animals except for hogs, I believe, they'll require some type of forage, based on how their, body functions. As in our lives as humans, we try to not eat as many calories and On the livestock side, we're trying to feed as many calories as we can. So when we're putting up wet hay in the spring, we plant a lot of rye, wheat mix, and we're walking them crops. I mean, daily, trying to figure out where that flag leaf is and what's going to be our greatest potential to harvest that crop to put up the best feed that we can put up for our own operation. So that goes hand in hand with the overfeeding and the palatability. If you got cows that are wasting a lot of hay and you're purchasing hay, and I have to talk to producers all the time. Well, I'm out here with the manure spreader and I'm hauling off 30% of my hay. Well, you just told me right then, what you're buying some hay that's evidently they're not eating 30% of it. So try to improve operations. The fourth and the final one, and this, it kind of goes all hand in hand, is the ration balance commodity cost. When you start looking at commodity cost, rations for, whether it be stocker cattle, dairy cattle, mature cows, fall pairs, whatever you want to look at, when you look at the corn and bean meal price and, other ingredients that you can feed, cottonseed hulls, all that stuff. When you have a lower ingredient price across the board, you can purchase a higher dollar value forage. And that leads back to the price. If you've got cheap commodities and cheap inputs, I shouldn't say cheap, but lower cost of inputs, and you can buy a little bit better hay depending on what you're needing out of it. I know corn stalks have become a big part of the rations in the last 5 to 10 years, and that's a commodity that seems to be getting more and more asked about in the north. Just because of the fiber and what it brings to the table for producers. So for right now, like I said, those are the 4 main things that I think influences a lot of things I'm testing your forage. So
that's great. Thanks, Greg. That's a great list. And I think I say this as an extension specialist a lot, is if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So that's a really good reason to test your forages. But I think, Jennifer, if we're going to test a forage, we need to have a sample, right? So if you would kind of talk a little bit about how we go about that.
Yep. So as when we start to talk about forage sampling, there's some things we need to think about before we actually get out there standing next to our haystack with our hay probe. Some things to consider is the first thing is we really need to identify the lot or lots of hay that we have in our barn. And so whether this is a hay producer or whether this is a livestock producer, we need to identify those individual lots, which are essentially defined as a uniform group of bales. And so from a nutritionist standpoint, the purpose of testing really is to understand the nutritional profile so that I can balance a diet most appropriately. And so if we're sampling and taking cores from all these different bales across multiple fields or multiple hay types, we're really not going to get a very accurate picture of the nutrients our horse or our cow is consuming on a given day. And so it's important that we identify these individual lots and then sample them individually and keep them separate so that we can modify the diet as we move through these different lots of hay. And so a lot is typically a single cutting from a single field made up of a single variety or hay type. And so there are lots of different factors that influence forage quality. A lot of them are related to how the forage is put up and how it is subsequently stored. And so the first cutting, second cutting, or third cutting from the same field can really be quite different. So I would encourage you not to mix these different cuttings and fields and hay types so that we can really understand what we're feeding our animals at a given point. The next thing to consider is when to actually sample. And so this is going to vary based on kind of your role. So as a hay producer, you're going to want to sample your hay kind of as close as possible to the point of sale so that when you are handing this analysis off, to the purchaser that's as accurate as possible in terms of the nutrient profile of that hay. Now, if you are a livestock producer, you are most interested in the nutrient profile of that hay at the time of feeding. And so you may or may not be feeding this hay right away. And so if it's been 6 or 10 or 12 months since you purchased the hay, you may consider going ahead and getting a second hay test done, just so that you can be as accurate as possible in terms of putting together your diet, because we know that that the nutrient profile changes over time, and that's especially true if hay is stored outside or under less than ideal conditions. And remember, the purpose of this forage testing, really from a livestock standpoint, is to optimize that nutrient intake by our livestock, not overfeeding, not creating a situation where the animals are going to waste the hay, but certainly meeting their requirements for maximum or optimum production, whatever that is, whether that's a racehorse, or that's a dairy cow, or that's a mama that's got a calf on her side. And so after we have identified our lot and decided, when we really need to sample, the next thing is to line up all of our tools that we're going to need. And to do this, we really want to utilize a hay probe. There are different methods of collecting a sample, one being the hay probe, the other being taking a grab sample. The grab sample is obviously much less expensive. It's pretty easy to do in terms of the concept. The challenge with taking a grab sample, though, is that you really want to take samples from within a bale. And so that means split several bales open, take a grab sample with your hand. You'll want to end up chopping that forage up to a smaller size so the lab can handle it. And so it really is pretty labor intensive to do. The alternative and the much better method is to utilize a hay probe. And you can see here on the slide that there are several different varieties on the market. This is just a sampling. There's actually a few others that people utilize. And I would encourage you to visit the website foragetesting.org for a more complete list of different types of probes. The probes range anywhere from $100 to $300. And so they're similar in terms of their makeup, their design. They're a metal hollow tube with a cutting edge on one end. And then at the other end, you can attach either the hand crank or you can attach a drill, whether that be a cordless or a corded drill. And you're basically going to take a core sample of these bales. Most of these probes are going to be somewhere between 3/8 and 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Anything smaller than 3/8 of an inch doesn't really give us a representative sample, because it essentially affects the amount of the forage to leaf ratio that gets collected. So we don't want something that's too small. If it's too large, if it's more than that 3/4 inch diameter, we're going to end up just collecting too much samples, because as I'll talk on the next slide, we're going to want to sample at least 20 bales from our lot of hay. And so if you've got a large probe, you're going to collect a lot of material, and you probably don't need all of that to send off. The length of the probe, somewhere between 12 and 24 inches for hay sampling. That allows us to core well into the center of that bale to get a good representative sample. And we want to make sure that we maintain that sharp cutting tip. And so over multiple uses, that tip will start to wear down, which is going to make collecting that sample more difficult. The hay probe really is the most accurate method of collecting that representative sample, because the idea is to get a sample that is really representative of the entire lot. So we're going to take multiple samples, we're going to combine them or compile them together. And if you think about how a hay bale is put together, each flake being compressed, or on a round bale, each layer represents kind of a different portion of the field. And so if you are only taking a hand sample, it's a very small proportion. Whereas if you're utilizing a hay probe, you're taking multiple samples throughout that bale from those various flakes, which just gives us a much more representative view of what the forage quality actually is. Once you have your hay probe, you're going to want to take a minimum of 20 core samples per lot of hay. And you certainly can take more than that, but 20 is a minimum. If we are talking about small squares, we can take 1 core per bale. If we're talking about large square bales or round bales, because there's so much more volume in a single bale, we can take 2 to 3 cores and then combine all those within our lot. We are going to want to sample at random, which means that we're going to want to walk around our haystack and collect from several different locations, not just from a single face. And so one of the things to consider is really how you plan to store your hay, whether you're the hay producer or the livestock owner, because we want to be able to sample it at some point. And so if it is, stacked in any of these left pictures, obviously very easy to get to. You can get to multiple sides of the bales and get to multiple bales. A little bit more challenging in these right pictures, right, where the bales are covered, and that's wonderful. We really want to cover bales for proper storage, but it becomes challenging to actually core them. And so just something to think about as you're stacking your hay and getting it stored. In this lower right picture, we really are only going to be able to sample this face of this hay pile, and probably not really representative of that entire haystack, because that face is really what is exposed to the sunlight and all of the environmental conditions. So, so just something to consider. It mentioned a minimum of 20 cores per lot. We would probably take a few more cores if we were talking about an especially large lot of hay, or if we had a lot of hay that we knew was pretty variable in terms of its content, just so that we can kind of get that the best picture possible. When we go to actually take our sample, we're going to attach the probe to the drill. We are going to put the 90-degree angle towards the center of the bale. When we're talking about the square bales, we're going to go from the butt end of the bale, not the side of the bale, because as I mentioned, we want to go through those multiple flakes. So we're going to come in at the end, at the center, top to bottom, left to right, so that we can avoid any change in the nutrient content due to the side being exposed to the sunlight. We are going to core towards the center of the bale. We're going to want to go in 12 to 18 inches to get a pretty representative sample. And then we will end up collecting about a half a pound of sample across all of those 20 cores. And so you can see sampling large squares would be very similar to small squares. When we are sampling round bales, we want to go in towards the center of that bale. And these bales both have the netting on the outside. You want to kind of pull that netting away and really get to the core, to the outer layer of the hay. Maybe pull some of that outer layer away just to get to the fresh hay that hasn't been directly exposed. So after you probe your bale, you are going to empty the probe itself into a clean bucket, and you will probe your other 20 bales and then mix all of those core samples together to create a composite sample. And then from that, you're going to transfer your content to a sealable bag. You're going to want a minimum of a half pound to send to the laboratory. So as I mentioned, if you're using that larger diameter probe, you may be generating more sample than what you actually need to send. But transfer it to a sealable bag. Make sure the bag is labeled appropriately so that you can identify that particular lot of hay with the analysis that comes back. And then you want to try to get it shipped off as soon as possible. But in the meantime, you want to make sure that you store it in a pretty cool and dry place. And so if our forages are pretty dry, which a lot of our hay is, 90% dry matter, just, keeping it in a cool, dry place is fine. If we think there's any moisture in that sample, probably want to go ahead and throw it in a cooler with a single ice pack just to keep it cool, to prevent any of that potential microbial or mold growth that might occur with the moisture in that. You're going to want to complete the paperwork or the submission form that goes along with that. There are multiple different analytical packages from different labs. And so basically find the lab that you're going to utilize, identify what they require for their submission form, get it filled out, and then you're going to want to get your sample shipped to that lab as soon as possible. And then as far as that actual lab goes, you're going to want to find a certified laboratory. And Travis will talk a little bit more about where those are and how you go about finding them. But once you've submitted that sample, you've really, you've passed the ball and it's in their court, and they're going to go ahead and get that analyzed for you.
Perfect. So that leads me right into talking about where maybe some local certified labs would be. And so the bottom bullet point has a list there at foragetesting.org. And under the links, there's some valuable information, but under those, under this link is a complete list of the certified labs. So for many of the folks that are here in Illinois and watching this video are probably familiar with AgriKing, located in Fulton, Illinois, and that would be our lone certified lab here in Illinois. But I receive samples and see a lot of producers that get samples in from these other labs, A&L, Dairyland, Rock River, and there's others. So be sure to visit that complete list there at the link. And then the next question that gets asked is, what about the cost? If I'm sending this off to a certified lab, what kind of cost am I looking at? And so here on the next slide, you'll see that there are some costs that we are normally looking at. And so for a normal cost, and I guess, Jennifer, if you want to advance that real quick, the costs on the next slide. For an NIR, which is pretty normal, what I would recommend on most forage samples, the cost would be about $20 to $40 per sample. We've got good technology here, and these machines are calibrated very well for forages. And so an NIR sample of a simple forage roughly runs $20. If we've maybe got some ensiled forages or silages that we want to test, we may want a complete forage test, and that can add just a bit of cost. But just be prepared, that $20 to $40 range per sample. And as we look at balancing rations, purchasing supplement feeds, this can be a great return on investment to know exactly what you have in your forages, as that is the base of your ration. Sometimes producers will look at the price sheet and they'll see a bunch of wet chemistry assays available. Most of those are actually $10 to $50 per assay, and so those costs can add up pretty quick. I would say don't feel intimidated there, because most of your samples you can just go ahead and run that NIR, which is a lower cost. The wet chemistry, if we've got some really odd or off samples or maybe some inconsistent results from NIR, we may want to run some wet chemistry analysis. But for the most part, producers can just look at that low cost NIR and get a simple or complete forage analysis for very cost effective, that $20 to $40 range. And then I always talk to cattle producers and livestock owners about talking to their feed company and their nutritionist. It makes sense for their nutritionist, if they're balancing rations, to have these forage samples to balance on. And so many times the cost will be covered of that analysis by the feed company. So reach out to those folks and they can help you as well. And I think next we'll talk about some abbreviations. So when you see a forage test, it can be intimidating. There's a lot of numbers, there's some abbreviations, and it can be daunting to try to take it all in and understand it. But some real quick, you can see here on this slide, dry matter, which is abbreviated DM, and moisture, crude protein, many people are familiar with. ADF, many times folks do not understand what ADF is, and that's really, we only see it here on this lab analysis a lot of times, but that's our acid detergent fiber. Really, it shows us the most indigestible parts of that forage, so cellulose and lignin. NDF, or neutral detergent fibers, really going to represent all of the fiber, and that can give us a bit of an insight as to the bulkiness of this hay and how much the livestock can actually eat. TDN is a measure of energy. We use most often in beef cattle. Relative feed value in the hay industry is used quite a bit as a barometer of quality and value. It can have some give and take, and that's a formulation. So just be aware that can still have some variation, and it may not always be indicative of what you need in your ration. So consult your nutritionist. Dry matter intake is common. Nitrate, nitrogen, nitrates is something that is potential danger that could be in in hays or silages. And so we need to be aware of that. And there's some other abbreviations as well, but certainly this gets you off on the right start. And if you have questions about understanding something like that, you can always reach out to us or an extension specialist to help you digest what would be on your hay analysis. So I think we actually have a hay analysis to pull up here. And so this would be fairly typical of what you would get back on more of a complete forage analysis. Up at the top, you see the moisture and dry matter. That's very important just to know what you're dealing with. Is this a dry hay, a wet hay? What moisture range is it? Would there be potential mold risk? And so some other things as we go down the list though, crude protein, we have our acid detergent and soluble crude protein, and those next two columns really are indicative of maybe some heat damage that has occurred and can reduce the available protein that's there. Back up to crude protein though, real quick, we just move over and you always want to look at dry basis. So some forage analysis will include the as is or wet. You always want to look at dry because that's an even measure. And that's what your nutritionist is going to use to balance rations with, is that dry basis. But our crude protein on this alfalfa hay is fairly low. And that kind of shows us maybe this hay is maybe a little poorer in quality. As we scroll down on the left side again to our ADF and NDF, those are our fiber measures. And we quickly see that those are a little elevated. And this forage analysis has a range here. And you can move over to the range and see that, yes, we are at the higher end of that range. So we've got some more mature forage, higher fiber levels. And then we could scroll down to some more details. But I think the next thing I look at as a beef nutritionist, I want to get to the energy. And so you can see some TDN and some other calculations made for net energy of lactation, gain, maintenance. And those are all crucial to see, probably plane of gain, and then how much true energy this forage is going to supply, and maybe if we need supplementation for our different stocks. So there's some other calculations made on the bottom left hand. And then also we've got sugar, fat, and there's a lot here. What a beef nutritionist would look for, it may be different than our dairy nutritionist or equine nutritionist, but those are kind of some of the things that I look at. And I know Greg mentioned ash earlier. So Greg, would you make some comments to maybe, what you look at here, and as someone who brokers some hay, and maybe lead us into some of your thoughts when you see this analysis, please.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Travis. As we look across the lines there with the ash content, it's at 11%. It's in a range of 8.8 to 13%. A lot of times this number gets elevated when you have some hay get rained on. And this sample here kind of looks like it might have been some probably some pretty mature stuff by the way the fiber is. And when you've got a thicker, more mature crop and it gets rained on, it takes a little bit more. A lot of times that's the cure, is to go back and turn it one more time, and that ash content can elevate because you've turned it twice. You've had to rake the field twice, whatnot. Sometimes producers go in and ted it apart. Like I said, the ash content, another thing that I highlight a lot is, that's 11% of that bale. If that bale weighs 1,000 pounds, 11% of it's just going to be, it's foreign material, dirt. Obviously, it could be fertilizer attached to the soil. I know a lot of hay samples that I've pulled in the past for producers, they always, this is my best hay field. And, but that's also where they spread their manure in the springtime. And when you're out there taking a forage sample and I've seen ash content samples get up there around 20-25%. Well, then when you start doing the math with them, I'm like, okay, so that's 1,000 pound bale and 25% of ash content. So sometimes that's not the right thing to do, spread manure in the springtime on the hayfield because that will obviously elevate that number as well. Another thing that I run across a lot, and producers are always like, yeah, this bottom number here on the calculations, you see the RFV number, and it's 100. I've got several producers. Oh, I've got 100 on RFV. I mean, my feeds jam up. I don't need to feed any supplement. I don't need to feed any distillers. I mean, and my cows are going to be perfect all winter long on this. They think 100 is the magical number. Well, that number can be 200 if you've put up some really high. I mean, on a wet analysis on wet hay, I've seen it get up there as far as 215, 220 before on some really, really rich alfalfa. So that RFV number, the sky's the limit on it. But 100 is not just a happy median to settle with. So those are kind of some of my thoughts on that forage analysis. Like I said, that's a pretty common mixed hay sample. I mean, that's a very good analysis to elaborate on and explain to folks what these things are.
And I would say from an equine standpoint, we're going to be looking at slightly different nutrients compared to what Travis looked at from a cattle standpoint. And we're certainly going to be looking at the moisture content. Anything much above 15, we're kind of getting concerned with potential for mold issues, and horses are going to be more susceptible to mold problems than what we typically see with cattle. So moisture would be something. We're also going to look at protein content to give us an idea of how much protein there is. When we talk about formulating horse diets, we actually spend a little bit more time talking about some of the specific amino acids that make up that protein, because protein quality is going to be more important than protein quantity. With that being said, we, as a very rough general rule, we say, a forage that's 10 to 12% protein will meet most of a maintenance horse's requirements. We'll move down and we look at fiber a little bit. So we look at ADF and NDF. Those gives us an idea of how digestible and how much forage this horse may be able to consume. So more about some of these components a little bit later. Sugars and starches and NSC, which is a calculated value down here, are also things that we spend more time looking at if we're formulating for horses versus cattle, because we have horses that have some metabolic concerns, and feeding high levels of those non-structural carbohydrates can compound some of those problems. And so that would be a component that we would look at. And then also to kind of look at the macro minerals, the calcium, phosphorus levels. And so it can be very overwhelming to look at all these numbers. We have all these different rows and columns and ranges. So certainly overwhelming to look at all of these, but we don't need to utilize all of these. One other thing that I did want to point out is this lower right corner where we have the energy values for this hay. These are all measures of ruminant energy. And so when we talk about equine diets and formulating to meet energy requirements, we utilize digestible energy as our energy currency, I guess. And so not all labs will calculate digestible energy. And so if you are specifically interested in putting together a horse diet and looking at the energy values, make sure that the lab has the ability of providing that for you. And if not, you may need to find another lab to do that. So with that, I guess we wanted to say thank you for joining us, and also give you kind of a sneak peek in the fact that this was just kind of a little bit of an introduction to some forage sampling and why it's important. And we'd like to put together some additional webinars that focus more on understanding what actually comes back on your analytical results here, and how we use that information, and why that information is important in equine versus ruminant diets, and what those values actually tell you, I guess, as a livestock owner. So stay tuned for those coming up in the future.
Perfect. You wrapped that up really good, Jennifer. And I think lastly, we just appreciate your attention and viewing this, and we want to invite you to check out Illinois Forage and Grassland Council. You can simply do that by visiting the website there at illinoisforage.org, or check us out on Facebook. We're always looking for new members and contributors. We look forward to you involving IFGC as a way to build your network. So thank you for your attention today, and take care.